Hello. Well, we come to the last session of this event. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce you to Adrian Forty, our plenary for this evening. I'll read just a short biography. Adrian is Professor Emeritus of Architectural History at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL, where he funded the master program in architectural history. He is the author of Objects of Desire, of Words and Buildings, also a vocabulary of modern architecture, and his latest book, Concrete and Culture, a material history, that was published in 2012. He was the president of the European Architectural History Network between 2010 and 2014. Well, it's a great pleasure to have you here, Adrian. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you for inviting me. I argued, one of the arguments that I made in Concrete and Culture, the book which Christian has mentioned, is that concrete is simultaneously both modern and unmodern. So I'll just spend a few minutes explaining how I developed this argument. Okay, so this really summarizes what I'm going to say over the next few minutes. Concrete is modern because it's liberating. It liberates us from constraints that we had before. It creates new freedoms. It's given us an unprecedented command over nature. It has made it possible to hold back the sea, as you see here, to join continents together. It's enabled us to build dams, superhighways, and so on. At the same time, it has made possible the construction of dry, reasonably healthy, earthquake-proof dwellings for a large part of the world's population. As far as architecture is concerned, it has liberated architecture from the tyranny of load-bearing walls, and the point of the domino system, as promoted by Le Corbusier, was that it demonstrated the freedoms that concrete offered to architecture. So it's been liberated in many different ways. And the other, perhaps, important modern feature of concrete is that it has transformed the nature of construction by largely removing the intellectual labour of construction from the building site into the engineering drawing office. So this is the drawing office of the early concrete contractor Ennebeek, and essentially these people are preparing how concrete buildings are to be built. With concrete, what used to be done through the skill and knowledge of building craftsmen was to an extent removed to these specialist engineers. So insofar as concrete has brought about a division of labour between manual and intellectual labour in construction, it conforms to our understanding of what it means to be modern. That modernity drives us towards a greater and greater degree of division of labour. So that's another sense in which concrete was modern. Now, if we turn to the unmodernity of concrete, its non-modern features, perhaps the first and most obvious of these is that it is resistant to perfection. The character of the materials that we know of as modern is that they are perfectible. They can be made perfect. Plastics, metals, glass, they all can be realized in perfect results. You know, the plastic water bottle, it's a perfect object. We assume that these sorts of materials lend themselves to perfect results. Concrete, however, is not like this. It is often not perfect to the eye. We see imperfections in it. And even the best laid concrete is never entirely even. It has irregularities in it. And this is something which people have accepted and lived with up to a point. There is also an inherent physical imperfection in concrete. And that is that in any piece of reinforced concrete, the concrete cover has to crack in order for the steel of the reinforcement to become active, so that there is an inherent imperfection in the supposedly perfect object. In order for, if you have a concrete beam, it's got reinforcement in it, only when the beam is loaded and the concrete inevitably, however microscopically, cracks, does the steel become active. So that even it has this structural imperfection in it. And despite the efforts of a great many people to standardize concrete, to make it into a homogeneous, uniform material, it frequently fails to do this. And a very nice example of this is the simple cube test. You know that this is the standard test for freshly made concrete. You put it into this little cube box. You allow it to cure for either 7 and 28 days, and then test it under compression, and you can measure the strength of it. But it turns out, this is from a research paper on concrete, was produced in the 1960s, that the cube tests on supposedly identical concrete specimens are widely different. That even this most basic test for establishing the consistency of concrete turns out to produce these fluctuating, varying results. So at a most basic level, what is meant to be perfectible evades the opportunity to be perfected. So imperfection is one characteristic of concrete that displays its non-modernity. Another is that concrete lacks transparency. It was the mission of modernity to get rid of mysteries, to make all secrets exposed and visible. Transparency was the mantra of modernity. No more mysteries. Now, in the field of materials, other modern materials achieved transparency. either literally, as in the case of glass, or through the way that they performed. With a steel structure, you can see how it stands up. The distribution of forces corresponds to the members of the construction. But with concrete, you can't see how the loads are distributed. There is no visual correspondence between the outward appearance of a piece of concrete and the actual distribution of forces within it. It's hidden from us. Moreover, the means by which rigidity is achieved in reinforced concrete, that is to say the steel, is invisible and remains invisible. And if you can see the steel, as in this diagram here, then the structure is going to fail. So there is again this lack of transparency in the medium. We can't see how it works. So it fails on this other sort of fundamental test of modernity, that things should be transparent. Okay, well those are a couple of the sorts of arguments that I have come across and thought about in relation to concrete, which makes it both modern and unmodern at the same time. And I think it has to be said that even amongst experts, concrete remained, and to some extent still remains, a mystery. And this is a quote from a very eminent structural engineer from the 1960s, kind of acknowledging this sense that, we don't know what's going on with concrete. It still somehow retains a mystery which other materials don't have. He wouldn't have said this about steel, but he can say it about concrete because it has this sense in which it's not, fully comprehensible, that it retains this aura of mystery about it. Now, in the era of modernism, so we come to the next part of what I'm going to say. In the era of modernism, there was a tendency to exaggerate the modernity of concrete and to suppress its non-modernity. And I'll take you through some of the features of this. But we could start with this quotation from George Orwell, which explains rather well the way in which modernity tended to see concrete. So the world is divided into two sides. On the one side, science, order, progress, internationalism, aeroplanes, steel, concrete, hygiene. And on the other side, war, nationalism, religion, monarchy, peasants, Greek professors, poets, horses. So that's the proposition. That's where modernism wanted concrete to be. Nonetheless, concrete has this tendency to slip across the boundary and to find itself on the other side amongst the peasants and Greek professors. But it was an effort to keep concrete on the side of modernity. How did this happen? And what I want to do is just to talk a bit about how the modernity of concrete was stressed and emphasized. Well, obviously the first thing to do was to make it scientific. The whole development of codes for concrete was a way to contain concrete and concrete construction within the language of science and predictive science. concrete technology becomes a branch of engineering. Concrete, engineering takes over concrete. It becomes a scientific discipline. There's a tendency to present the whole field of working concrete as a technical matter which is subject to scientific norms. And I like images like this because the guys are wearing white coats on site, on a building site. There's this sense that they want us to know that they're technicians. They're dealing with hard science. This is a scientific matter, making concrete. Everything possible in the kind of propaganda around concrete in the period, particularly sort of 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, is done in order to hide the messiness of concrete and to make sure that we see it as being a scientific medium. There's a constant emphasis on innovation, on the development of new techniques, new processes. Concrete cannot be allowed to stand still. It has to be innovatory. And, again, I love this image of the staff in this concrete experimental works, testing the dome here, demonstrating this early shell dome. This kind of innovation is essential within the modernity of concrete. It has to innovate. The second kind of way in which the modernity of concrete is exaggerated is through standardization. And I see the whole attempt to standardize concrete through prefabrication systems as a strategy to overcome concrete's inherent imperfection and to secure concrete as a modern product. Prefabrication systems are a way of making sure that we have a consistent medium, components that are uniform, can be repeated endlessly, and all signs of imperfection are eliminated in theory from it. Modularity, which is the, if you like, the other half of system building, that is to say the development of a system of interchangeable components, is seen as being a key to modernity. The making of these panels, we've seen lots of panel systems in production over today, and the presence of these systems is part of this drive to emphasize the modernity of concrete. There's a nice quote here from the Hungarian writer György Kepes, in which he points out the sense in which modularity is part of modernity. It's inherent in the conditions of our own time, as he says. And what we're looking for is the search for modules with the greatest combinatory possibilities. The ideal is a standard module that can be coupled with others into the widest variety of products. And he's talking in general terms here. This is the manifestation of modernity, and clearly concrete is made to conform to this, this principle. if it can conform to this principle, then its disorderliness and its imperfectibility can be overcome. Prefabricated systems are a way to guarantee the modernity of concrete. And then in architectural terms, the modernity of concrete was emphasized by making it heroic. So in buildings like this, there's a tendency always to want to prove something with concrete architecture from the era of high modernism. The longest spans. You have this impossibly long and apparently slender beam that's supporting this building. We're exaggerating the qualities of concrete, or in this case, we have the longest cantilever, the largest cantilever. Every building is trying to push the material to its limits. The expectation on architects is that they should always be trying to prove something when they're using the medium of concrete, because otherwise concrete fails to seem modern. They must be showing that they're innovating with the material, that they're driving it forward, that they're doing things that have not been done before, because otherwise concrete slumps back into the residuum of traditional building processes. It can't be allowed to stand still. So this is the characteristics. These are the sorts of characteristics that we see being applied to concrete in the mid-20th century and really up until the 1970s. And then things change after the period around the 1970s. We saw in Eric's talk that moment of disenchantment with welfare state programs. In Western Europe, at least, concrete becomes a demonized material and largely disappears for a time, disappears from view. Now, in the more recent past, what I want to argue is, after modernity, is that concrete's previous disadvantages, its non-modernity, turn out to be something of an advantage. And this is really the crux of what I have to say, that concrete's previous handicaps, its apparent non-modernity, turn out to be to its advantage. Now, if we think about it, other materials, steel, glass, plastics, are wholly identified with modernity. They cannot discard or even disguise their modernity. They cannot but be modern. They can only be modern. But concrete fares rather differently in this process. Concrete, because of its other half, if you like, its dark side, its unmodern side, although initially disgraced and demonized in the 1970s, by the early 90s, people start to realize that concrete's non-modern qualities are something of an asset. They allow concrete to be used in ways that do not identify the products made with concrete with modernity. So if we take in architecture, we start seeing buildings like this. This is a signal box in Zurich. These were rather startling when they first appeared, because for much of the 20th century, architects had been trying to make buildings, and buildings made out of concrete, appear to be weightless, or at least gravity defying. And then things change. There starts to be an acceptance of the massiveness and the weight of concrete structures. Buildings are allowed to be solid in a way that had not previously been considered the case. Sometimes there's a deliberate ambiguity about this. So this is another Swiss building. This is the Schaulager in Basel, which, seen from this angle, appears to be a very thick, massive construction, although it has this perforated wall in it, but the concrete itself appears to be heavy and massive. Though you go around the other side, and it appears to be paper thin. It suddenly changes. And I mean, clearly Herzog and de Meuron are playing around with this ambiguity as to whether this is a thick wall or a thin wall. But I'll take another example, a more recent example. This is the extension to the Landesmuseum in Zurich. The older building is the building under scaffolding in the background. It's a building from about 1900. And then this new building in concrete in the foreground is something which is excessively heavy and solid and massive. It has weight. It has mass. And these are deliberate. The architects said when they were designing this building that they wanted to use the language of infrastructure, and they refer to, you know, the dams and the highways that had been built in the Swiss Alps, and they wanted to connect the architecture of this building to what they saw as being the solidity of those earlier engineering achievements, and which is very much in contrast to the older building which you can see here. But it also turns out that weight and mass are an asset in environmental terms also, because of the properties of thermal mass that concrete can play upon and take advantage of. That the concrete can be used to store heat or coldness, and so even out the temperatures inside the building. So this has become a kind of a routine use of concrete in what appear to be often quite heavy concrete structures. The Landesmuseum has an extra dimension to it, which is that the concrete mass of the building is actually cooled with water pipes that are laid in it, and it draws water from the river which runs nearby to cool the building down in summer. So you have a large building without any air conditioning in it. It's possible to have a thermally very efficient building where the mass of the concrete becomes an active factor in controlling the climate inside. Another example of that, this is a recent office building in London, and like many new buildings, the interior soffits are left exposed inside the building to act as a coolant for the climate inside. And in this particular case, the floor slabs, again, have water pipes in them so that during the summer, when the temperature rises inside the building, the slab is cooled to bring down the internal temperature. And again, it's a building without air conditioning. It's a large office building which has been possible without air conditioning. So mass starts to matter in building. Mass is acceptable for the first time in 20th century, or becomes more acceptable than it had previously been in 20th century architecture. Okay. Now, what about perfection and imperfection? So we've seen one of the conditions of concrete is that it tends to be imperfect. The architecture of the mid-century went to great lengths to make it perfect. There's now been, a recognition that concrete is not perfectible and that the variations that occur in concrete can be an advantage. So in this building, this is there were iron filings mixed in with the concrete so that the building was allowed to rust naturally. It acquires a patina over time, and it changes over time. There have been all sorts of experiments that people have done with things which in a way exploit the non-perfectibility of concrete to allow it to change or age in ways that are not entirely predictable. So this is another case of people, being able to exploit an aspect of concrete which was previously suppressed but is now turned to advantage. The standardized systems, which had been such a strong feature of concrete in the mid-century, ceased to be such a desirable goal. All those mid-century attempts to reduce concrete construction to a few components turn out to be pointless, or if not pointless, it's not worth the effort. Concrete, as we've seen this afternoon, is probably much better suited to the non-standard than it is to the standard. So the endless variation which is offered by digital fabrication turns out to be an opportunity in relation to concrete. The impulse to standardize is no longer essential or necessarily desirable. Concrete is much better suited to endless variation. Finally, I'm going to just want to end with this building, which I think is interesting in relation to the discussion about concrete after modernity. This is the memorial to Jews in the Judenplatz in Vienna, done by the British artist Rachel Whiteread. And this is interesting because in this case, concrete is being used to do an unmodern thing. It's being used to prolong memory. The purpose of this is to be a memorial. And the memorial is the negative cast of the interior of a book-lined room. Okay? All of which, these things don't particularly resonate with the language and rhetoric of modernism. It's a non-modern project. And it's very massive. It's very solid. But the irony of this is that the mass refers to what's not there. it's a cast of something that's not there anymore. But there are things about this which are modern. So the casts of the books that you see here are in fact a serial repetition. All the book sections, and they're cast in blocks of, I think it's 16 or I can't remember, 13 or 16 books, are a repetition. So in that sense, they belong to the language of modernity, seriality, repetition. And you could see these as being panels, if you like. They're a kind of rather elaborated, deep relief panels that have been fixed onto the surface of the building. And they're very finely fabricated. And there's a close-up, and it's been damaged on the corner here, but you can see the effect of the thing. And I mean, what I would say about this is that it's an inside-out work. It's literally inside out. But it also turns concrete's relationship to modernity inside out. It inverts what previously had been thought of as being the norms about concrete, so that we see them somehow in an inverse kind of way. It changes our understanding of concrete. And I see this as being quite a good summary of some of the issues around concrete after modernity. And essentially, that's my point, is that concrete after modernity recovered some things that it had previously not wanted to know about. They come back. It regains a currency, a vibrancy, a strength through being able to draw upon these aspects that had previously been ignored and suppressed. Okay, that's my argument.
Hello. Perhaps you would like to stay there or grab a seat, whatever you prefer. Many thanks for that wonderful talk, and I open the floor for questions if there are any. I can break the eye again. I have a question that is similar to what, or related to what Rodrigo was saying earlier. That's perhaps the difficult question for someone who is familiar with the procedures and the goals of a historian, which is to perhaps turn around and look to the future and perhaps further ahead. So would there be other twists and moves that might come, perhaps not just after modernity, but also, or modernism, but also perhaps thinking of the environmental challenges that are related or coming, are becoming more visible with regards to concrete?
Well, as I think we've gathered from the discussions earlier on, we haven't really started to deal with the problems around the environmental aspects of concrete. You know, as Helen has said, concrete is a very expensive material whose costs we don't recognize. It's expensive, but we use it as if it's a cheap material. And, you know, this is clearly, I think that's very well put. It's a very clear statement of the issue. It has it has a long history of being cheap. And it has, that is on the one hand, to some extent, that has been one of its virtues, its strengths, if you like, has been its cheapness, that's why it's been able to be so effective in the last 100 or 120 years or so that it's been widely available. Cheapness has been its asset. The problem, I think, is how do we turn this round now to think about it as an expensive material? This is going to demand some fairly major rebalancing and readjustment in our thought systems. I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is, where do we put concrete inside our heads? Where does it belong within our own mental schema? And for most people, it belongs in the bit of, says, cheap stuff. We've somehow got to move it over to the other side, which says it's expensive stuff, it's gold, it's not earth, and that, I don't know how you bring that about. I think that's, it's a really interesting question.
Can I jump in something related to that I found very interesting in how you speak about the material in your book? Something that struck me, perhaps because I've been interested in engineers working with concrete, is how you move to speak of it as a medium.
Yeah.
And I wonder for whom is a medium?
Yeah.
Most likely for architects. But when we talk about the environmental point of view, or the change that will come from it turns quickly into material.
Yeah.
And and I think there is an important tension there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you would like to.
I mean, I've talked about it as a medium because I'm interested in what it says about human relationships, social relationships generally. And it seemed to me that it, has had fairly profound effects upon social relationships and relationships of all kinds, and that it has behaved in the same way as other media do, which is why I prefer to call it a medium rather than a material, because material immediately classifies it along in material science with something that just has certain physical or chemical properties. And I was interested in thinking about its social or metaphysical properties. So, yes, I mean that's, I think is important. Now, your question is how is it useful to think about it as a medium when we think about it in terms of sustainability and CO2 emissions and so on? Yeah, I mean, that's a good, I'm not sure I have an answer to that one. What would be the consequences of that? We're dealing with something, it draws attention to the transactional nature of concrete by calling it a medium. And to some extent, all the issues around CO2 emissions do need to be seen as transactional. Somebody benefits, somebody loses in CO2 emissions. Broadly speaking, the Western world benefits, the less developed world suffers in relation to CO2 emissions, whether it's rising sea levels or whatever it is. We're thinking about it in terms of gains and losses. Can those sorts of transactions then be brought into thinking about how concrete is used, whether it's used sparingly in one place, liberally in another? Maybe, I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. Yeah.
More questions? Yeah.
Yeah.
Voy a hacer mi pregunta en español. Mi pregunta es si...
Wait a moment, I need to put my headphones on.
Eso. Mi pregunta es si este ocultamiento de la no modernidad del concreto reside más en los autores o será en la historia hecha sobre las obras y sobre los arquitectos. Estoy refiriéndome a mediados de los 50, si será una tarea, ese ocultamiento, una tarea compartida, más en las obras o más en la historia sobre esas obras, si vale la pena hacer el distingo. ¿No? I can try to do it in English. I can try to do it in English. I don't know if you're going to... Well, so if this hiding of the unmodernity of the concrete belongs more to the authors of the architects, or it's the responsibility is shared with the history, or if you wouldn't, would you do that distinction between history and authors?
Well, there's a question, in this argument that the non-modernity of concrete was suppressed. Who did the suppressing? Who was responsible for doing this? And as I see it, quite a lot of different actors were complicit in this. But essentially, it comes from the cement and concrete industry itself, which are concerned to promote their product as being a modern product. And then architects, by and large, serve that end in the modernist era, at least. That architects, as I see it, are responsible. They take some of the blame for having perpetuated, prolonged this image of concrete as being a non-modern, a modern and not non-modern substance. But, lots of people who have nothing to do with the industry are quite happy to go along with this. It's a convenient truth. And so the George Orwell quote that I gave you, he has no connection with the cement and concrete industry. This is just a general statement by an intellectual about where he thinks concrete belongs. And this is, one can understand why people should have said this, because it seems to make the world a better place. If you can see it as being a modern material that brings about material improvements in the world, it behaves in a modern way, then who's to say no? Why should we object to this? So I think, everybody was complicit in this. It was very difficult for people, I think, to say, hold on, concrete is not as modern as all that. But there are people who do. And, there are some architects who do things with concrete, even in the middle of the 20th century, that are not consistent with it being a modern material, who recognize that it has these, if you like, kind of atavistic, primitive qualities, which make it much, it's like mud. One has this kind of recognition that this is something which is doesn't behave in an entirely modern way, and that there are certainly architects who explore things to do with this, in a tentative way. But I think, as I see it, it was essentially an argument that you couldn't say no to for much of the 20th century. It was very difficult to say, hold on, concrete isn't really modern at all. It had too much to offer, for that to be a sustainable point of view. And it's still not, it's only partially possible, I think. But I think there is an opportunity now for us to accept that it is more than one thing, that it can be both modern and unmodern.
There was,
Well, David had his hand up first, actually, and then Eric.
I would like to know, what do you think? Something about perfection and imperfection in concrete. Do you think it's being not perfect becomes because it has been used by architecture and infrastructure? I think that because here in Chile we have a sculptor, ¿cómo se llama este hombre? Asler, Federico Asler, that works with concrete and does perfect, almost perfect concrete. So could it be that this sense of imperfection comes from being used by architecture?
Yes, I mean, it's certainly present in architecture. It's visible in architecture because, as anybody who's worked with concrete knows, particularly with in situ concrete, it never turns out quite how you expect. Something will always be slightly different. So it has that unpredictability. And people have tried to avoid this, but you will always get air bubbles in it. You will have stains that appear in it, and so on and so on. That whatever you do, there are these imperfections. I think it's possible for a sculptor who's working under very controlled conditions to produce something that is nearly perfect. I think that is probably feasible. But as soon as you're building, on a building site where who knows what goes into it, the control becomes impossible. The risks are so enormous that it becomes. You're right. In architecture, imperfection is not possible. And I mean, obviously, the thing that's also given concrete a bad name is its use by self-builders. The way in which it's used, cheaply or crudely, is often seen as being not so. Sorry.
Dangerous. It's even dangerous.
And dangerous as well. So it often the distinction between what is well done and what is being done by some self-builder to the uninformed person is often not apparent. That the two will become confused together, I think. So imperfection is something that creeps in, as it were, from the lower world of concrete construction too, I think I would say also. But yes, I think, it's in architecture and engineering that the imperfections lie. Eric?
Yeah, thank you. I wondered if we shift scale, from the object or the building to the city or the urban condition, and the one challenge that we haven't touched upon is urbanization. And the kind of the preeminent material of urbanization is concrete. We are continuously surrounded by and moving about within and on top of and underneath concrete. How does this affect our relationship to the material? It was touched upon, I think, in your introduction as something invisible that we don't ever see as flowing, but it is always there. And as urbanization continues, you know the figure of 70% in 2050 of the 9 billion people who will be inhabit the Earth will live in cities, and they will be made of concrete. How do we approach that in terms of a relationship to the material?
Well, again, its use in urbanization is part of the cause of its bad name. There's that sense in which concrete has made everywhere seem the same. You can't tell where you are at first sight because it's all concrete. That's, the reputation it has gained is as somewhere that is a raised difference between places and made everywhere the same. And if things carry on, that we'll have more of that. The world is going to become even more homogeneous, more uniform than it was before. I don't know what the answer to this is, but you're right that as the world becomes more urbanized, there's going to be more and more of this stuff around. Maybe if we can somehow change the way in which we set the value of it, in the way in which Helena was suggesting, then maybe we might become more discriminating in how we perceive it also. But there are quite a lot of things that would have to change for that to happen, I think.
Yeah, we're far from thinking we're walking around cities of gold.
No, exactly. But there's a project for somebody to change our perception of what it is that surrounds us.
But I would like to go back to the question that Christian posed earlier, and just now thinking, if we need to, you just said we need to change maybe the perception of how we see concrete, but also you said before, the question was that in environmental discussions we think of it as material, and rather architects might think of it as a medium. But if it's a medium, then maybe you could think of different ways or different materials with which you could achieve the same things. So maybe it's also about thinking, how could we do maybe cities or even dams or bridges, I don't know, with something different, if it's only a medium?
Well, I mean, yes. We use far more concrete than we need to, because it's easy, because it's relatively cheap, and because it has an aura of progress and modernity about it. So, in parts of Latin America, there are, and indeed a lot of Asia, we have, earth brick construction, which has been around for a long time. It's perfectly good for low buildings, up to 1 and 2 stories. It's perfectly possible to build very satisfactory buildings using earth bricks. But yet people don't want to do this because we've got this magic material that seems to be better, and in a way, in some senses, is easier. It's easier to. You don't have to maintain it in the same way as if you build with earth bricks. You have to waterproof them and make sure that they're not attacked by damp and so on. So, and they have less earthquake resistance. So, there are all these things which make us reluctant to use the alternatives, but the alternatives are there and actually work perfectly well. And I'm constantly aware of the sense that, people will use cement rather than the alternatives just because it's easy, But, for example, it's perfectly possible to do a lot of the things that you do with cement by building with lime, which it requires less CO2 to produce it. It's a much less CO2 heavy substance, but lime, which is produced by burning a chalk at a lower temperature, is a much less destructive, harmful substance. But it's more difficult to use. It has to be used with more care and so on. So it requires a return to skills and crafts which maybe are not so present as they have been. But yes, I mean, the shock I always see is people using cement when they need not use it.
More questions? Can I add something briefly onto that last discussion? That I think the sourcing ingredients is also very important, and I think at least for the industry, the magic trick has been also not just the cement, that you can source it in many places around the world, the basic ingredient to produce it, but also that the other ingredients are often available, the sand, the aggregate, almost everywhere in the world. So that's sort of, there is something interesting, I think, in this issue, whether if it is a medium, then we just change the material. But there are materials here that are so common and so abundant in a way. Although people are talking about sand becoming a scarce resource in the future because we have used it so widely and intensively.
If you talk to the people who promote these alternative materials like mud bricks and rammed earth construction, Pise, Adobe, what they say is that the problem about using them is that they're not recognized in the building codes in most places, and that therefore it's impossible to get building approval, or very difficult to get building approval for them, because all the norms are set in relation to cement and concrete construction. That this has become the standard through which constructional safety is judged. So if you then revert to some other less energy expensive material, people say, oh, well, you'll just have, we can't calculate this. This is outside the rules. We don't know about this. So that, again, is a problem that, people frequently have come up against, I think, in trying to reintroduce other methods of construction, or, even using, mixing cement with other ingredients which are maybe less energy expensive, have always create difficulties because people aren't necessarily used to this.
Another question? Well, if there are no more questions, I would like to thank Adrian